Begin the Quran Daf, Mesechtes Beitzah Daf, begin 13 lines down at the top of the Yomit, where the Gemara continues halacha of our Mishnah. The Gemara discusses at length the two machlekes in Misham Hill regarding Shalmei Chayva, regarding Oilas Re'iyah, but machlekes Misham Hill regarding Shalmei Chayva if you do the smicha, and regarding Oilas Re'iyah if you even bring it. And the Gemara discusses the source reasons for the respective opinions of the Hill and Misham. She's Kuzban because of Knecheskel for Entem Bevachem, she's going to today's daf, as I get the Kivitl. Some of the things we're going to discuss in today's daf are the machlekes of Bisham Hill, whether one may perform a smicha on the carbon on Yom Tov. The halachas of Nedarim and Davis as it relates to Yom Tov, are you allowed to bring a carbon that's donated or that you took a vow to bring on Yom Tov? The halacha of Tekiv l'smicha shchita, which is, do you say that right after you do smicha, which you lean on your carbon, then it has to be automatically slaughtered, which we learn out one from the other because it says in the same pasuk, samach v'shachat, and therefore because the hekesh has to be right after that. Smicha is the halacha that you lean with all your might on your carbon. That becomes a discussion regarding Yom Tov, because on Yom Tov you're not allowed to be mishtamish b'balachayim. You can't use an animal, and if you're leaning all your weight, so that would be forbidden possibly. Binyan Av is a halachic principle that it says in one context from the Yidkim Amidas, Shatur and Jeshbin, Beitzah Rabbi Shmuel, and that you compare it to all similar types of contexts. So the Gemara begins 13 lines down at the top of the Yom Daf, Chafam and Aleph, where we had a machlekes of Bisham Hill. Both of them agreed by Shama Chagiga that you're allowed to bring it on Yom Tov. The only machlekes was, are you allowed to do smicha? Bisham says you cannot do smicha because you're getting utilizing an animal, you reichav gab behema. This one says, no, you could do smicha. That's why Gemara discusses their halachas. The Gemara begins as follows. There's a teacher of Braisis who taught in front of Bitzah Abba. The following pasuk in Yikra says, "Vayakar v'sa'oilo." What are we talking about over here? This is the oila of the Shmini Lamalum. That was the first day of Rosh Chodesh Nisan after the Shivas Yimei HaMalum. That day there was a carbon oila that Aaron HaKohen had an obligation to bring for Chayvas Hayim, but that specific day, as it says, Yikra says, "Kachla Egel Ben Bakar Lachatus." You had to bring a complete oila that was an oil that was a ram. So the pasuk is saying that he should sacrifice the oila by yaseha kam mishpat. He should do according to the mishpat. Now, when you tell me to bring it like the mishpat, what mishpat are you talking about? So says the Beitzah, kam mishpat oilas nedava, like the mishpat that it says by the donated oila. Meaning, doesn't say anywhere else a mishpat, a halachic criterion by an obligatory oila like Aaron had. This is a choy that he had to bring. So therefore, what the Bryce is telling us that which mishpat is it referring to? By oilas nedava. You could bring a nedava anytime you wanted to. You could donate an oila. It says in the beginning of a yikra. Now all the halachas of oila and shlam are there in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra, and those psukim are talking about oilas nedava. How do we know? Because it says Adam ki yaakov mikem, which sounds like, yeah, whenever that you want to. That's a oilas nedava. Now, it says over there, the samach yadai, that he's going to do smicha. So therefore, when it says kamishpat over here by oilas chayva, an obligatory oila that Aaron had to bring, it's coming to teach that limud al oilas chayva, it's teaching when you have an oila that you have to bring, like Aaron's oila, or any other oila that you have to bring for that matter, shatu'un smicha, that it has to have smicha, like all the other halachas that it says over there by the nedava. That's what the teacher of this brisa was saying in front of Rabbi Abba. So Malay, so Abba, he thinks, and he says, wait a second, Damalach Mani, who is the Tana of this brisa? Who has to say such a thing that you need kamishpat to tell you this halacha that oilas chayva is going to have the halacha of smicha to learn it out from oilas nedava? Says, why is he learning it from the word kamishpat? Why isn't he learning it out from the halachic concept of a binyan av? Binyan av means to say like mamatzin. It's the same idea. Binyan mamatzin, like azoy megefin dort, mezok tezab azar doichen. Which is, you could say, wait a second, just like we find mamatzin, just like we find by nedava, that it's an oila and requires smicha. You have to lean on it before you bring it. So to oilas chayva is an oila and it requires smicha. Who is the Tana that's not learning out from a binyan av? Who has to learn out from the word kamishpat? And it doesn't say mishpat anywhere by oilas chayva. Oh, like the mishpat oilas nedava. What mishpat? Oh, that is smicha. Who is this Tana? Beis Shammai. It must be Beis Shammai, which they say in our Mishnah. It's like a shtig of a lomdisha, like that's what you see. thinking and figuring out who is the Tana, can't be, it has to be Beis Shammai. Why? Because Beis Shammai said in the Mishnah that you could bring a shlomim on Yom Tov, that's a chayv, like Shalmei Chagiga, which you have an obligation to bring. But, said Beis Shammai, you're not allowed to do smicha on that shlomim. Why? Because where does it say smicha on shlomim? It says it in Vayikra. And there also, it's talking about Shalmei Nadava when you're donating a shlomim. Because it says, V'im said of shlomim karbanoi. What's V'im? What's nice V'im? If you want to. And then it says over there, Samach Yodai. Oh, so obviously, because Beis Shammai holds, you can't learn out. There's a little bit of a cheshbon over here, but it's like a shmak cheshbon, how he's showing you the Tana must be Beis Shammai, not Beis Hillel. Because Beis Shammai obviously doesn't learn out Shalmei Chayva like the Shalmei Chagiga, which is a chayva to bring from Shalmei Nadava. Why? Why didn't you say that Azay B'Zuk by Nadava, you know the same thing as by Chayva? No. You could ask on that binyanav, because you could say Nadava is commonly found because people bringing an opportunity to bring to the base of Mikdash, people always bring Shalmei Nadava. How are you going to say by Shalmei Chayva, which is only when you're obligated? Who knows when you can have an obligation? Well, okay, Shalosh Regalim. When else do you have a chiyuv to bring a shlomim? So therefore, it's smicha, which actually Kivega gets all busy on this words of Rashi. He says, what are you talking about? How can you say that it's smicha, it should not be Decha Yom Tov? I mean, forget, if there's no halacha of smicha on Shalmei Chayva, then how are you ever allowed to do smicha at all? Could that be considered that you're utilizing, even by Chayla should be forbidden because you're doing avodah b'kadishim. You're using all your kayach. So forget, you're doing an avodah, you're doing malacha with that's Kivega's question on Rashi. But one thing is, the reason why Beis Shammai says you can't do smicha Yom Tov is because what's your head to go out and do it? There's no source of doing smicha on Shalmei Chayva. So therefore, Beis Shammai says, no smicha on Yom Tov. Even on Shalmei Chayva, which you have to bring, no smicha. Because who said this smicha? It says Beis Shammai Nadava. We don't learn out. You can't compare Chayva to Nadava. Oh, so then Oylas Chayva also, which is what this Beitzah is talking about. Again, don't confuse the Shlomim and Oyla. We're showing that Beis Shammai doesn't learn that Shlomim of Chayva from Nadava. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Abba is telling the Tisha Beitzah, so he must be the same one who would say, by Oylas Chayva, you also wouldn't learn out from Oylas Nadava that there's smicha, if not for the fact that the pasuk says kamishpat. If it didn't say kamishpat, you wouldn't say that this smicha because you can't learn out Chayva from Nadava. Nadava people are always bringing. Chayva is whenever there's an obligation. Now, how often does it happen? So therefore, the Tana of the Brisa must be Beis Shammai, and that's how you know that's halacha of smicha because it's kamishpat because you can't learn out from a binyan. You can't just compare Mama Tzina by Nadava. There's something by Chayva. Because the Beis Hillel says if you would think the Tana of the Brisa is Beis Hillel, can't say that. Because Kivan the Garmi Shalmei Chayva Mishalmei Nadava, since they evidently hold that you learn out Shalmei Chayva from Mishalmei Nadava, how do we know this? Like Rabbeinu Chananel says, because in our Mishnah we said that you bring a shlom and you do smicha. How you allowed to do smicha? I do is rabbanon. How you allowed to do is rabbanon? What do you mean? Because the chayva. If you do shchita, you do all the types of things. You have a chiyuv to do v'samach v'shachat. How do you know Shalmei Chayva has smicha? How are you allowed to do it? What do you mean? Because it says b'Shalmei Nadava. Oh, Beis Hillel, you learn how Shalmei Chayva b'Shalmei Nadava. Okay, then Oylas Chayva not related to Ba'ikra. Well, why do you mean kamishpat to tell me kamishpat? Which mishpat? Oh, it's the mishpat that it says by Nadava. What do you need a pasuk for? What do you mean? Digamim Oylas Nadava. You learn it out from Oylas Nadava. Obviously, the Tana of the Brisa can't be Beis Hillel because you wouldn't need kamishpat. You obviously would know from a bin av. To which the Gemara asks, wait a second. How does Rabbi Abba know this? Beis Hillel. For who said that Beis Hillel's source is Shalmei Chayva Mishalmei Nadava Gamri, which is the whole basis of Rabbi Abba's point to show that it can't be like Beis Hillel, because where does Beis Hillel get you doing smicha on Shalmei Chayva of Chagiga on Yom Tov? It doesn't say in the Torah, must be Lunza Mishalmei Nadava. Who said? Maybe the truth is, no, that you cannot learn out Chayva from Nadava, and Beis Hillel actually knows Shalmei Chayva from Shalmei Nadava. Dilma, maybe Shami Chayva, may Oilas Chayva Gamri. And therefore, V'Oilas Chayva Gufa Ba'Yikra. That's why Oilas Chayva needed the pasuk of Kamishpat. So it's like it's written explicitly over there. Rashi probably said those words at least mafurish, because else you run into the problem like Taisa says about how could you learn that Dav Alamid Behekish and Bechayzim Alam Ben Yav. But be that as it may, it's like it says by Oilas Chayva that you need to do smicha because it says Kamishpat. Now, if not, you wouldn't know that Oilas Chayva needs smicha. And then you wouldn't know Shami Chayva either. But therefore it says the Gemara, you could say that that Brisa is like Basil, because Basil doesn't learn out Chayv from the Dava. Who told you that the reason why Basil says in our Mishnah that you can do smicha on the Shami Chayv because you learn from Shami Dava? You can't learn out Chayv from the Dava. So then how does he know smicha? I'll tell you, he knows them Oilas Chayva. They're both Chayvas. So they're just like they require smicha, so to here. But how do you know Oilas Chayva? You can't learn that from Oilas Nadava. Oh, that's in Kamishpat. And that is the source of Basil. So therefore, what's the raya of a Yitzchak Barab? So it says the Gemara, you can't say that. You know why? Because Maishna, what's the difference? You're telling me Shami Chayva, Misham Nadava, you can't learn that from Sham Nadava. Why not? So the Gemara is going to say the svara that we said already before in passing, Shikim Mitsuyin, because Sham Nadava is very common. So you bring it all the time, maybe that's something that's more of a severity factor, and therefore then you would have to do smicha. If that's the case, that you tell me you can't learn that from Shami Chayva, so we're getting this idea that you learn on Shami Chayva, and your whole Torah you're going to tell me that how it's going to be Basil, because you learn from Oilas Chayva, you can't learn from Oilas Chayva either. You know why? Shkin Kol. Oila is more chamer than Shlam, even though they're both Chayva, because it's totally burnt on Mizbeach. Shlam is not totally burnt, it's not as chamer. So maybe only by Oilas Chayva you have Smicha. So how you're going to be stuck anywhere? How's Basil going to know Shami Chayva if you tell me you want to learn from Oilas Chayva? So says the Gemara, no, that's not a difficulty. Because Ela Asya Mid Beinaya. You can learn that from both of them together, from the two of them. Meaning, the Gemara is remaining with what Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Abba said to that teacher, the Brises, that the Brisa cannot be like Beis Hill. I mean, that actually, the Gemara remains with its question on Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Abba, that you actually could be the Tana is Beis Hill, and it's going according to even Beis Hill, not like Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Abba. And that even according to Beis Hill, you need the pasuk of Kamishpat. And that, and once you have the source of smicha ba'oilas chayva from that pasuk, that's how you're going to know Shami Chayva. From which? From the two of them. From Shami Nadava and from Oilas Chayva, from a mamatzina of the two of them together. Because, let's start off with one of them. We'll say, okay, we'll learn that from Sham Nadava, that needs smicha. So too, Shami Chayva, which are shlam like it, requires smicha. But then you're going to ask and say, wait a second, Sham Nadava ametzuyin. How can you learn that to Shami Chayva? I'll tell you, Oilas Chayva techiach will disprove that, which Oilas Chayva is not Mitsuya. It's the same thing as uncommon when it's a Chayva that you have. And still needs Smicha, so to all include Shami Chayva, which even though it's not Mitsuya, just like Oilas Chayva is not Mitsuya, requires Smicha, so too does Shami Chayva. But then you can ask, wait a second, how can you learn from Oilas Chayva? Oilas Chayva is cold, is totally burnt, in contrast to Shami Chayva, which are not totally burnt. I'll tell you regarding that point, Sham and Nadava will disprove that. Because Sham and Nadava are not totally burnt. And it also requires smicha. And that's what's called v'chazir adin, lo ri'izeh k'ri'izeh. What does that mean? Meaning, you can't compare the characteristic of Oilas Chayva to the characteristic of Sham and Nadava. Meaning, if you want to say that the reason why that the halacha would require smicha, like by Shami Nadava, is because of Mitsuyin, can't say that, because Oilas Chayva doesn't have that. And you can't say the characteristic of Sham and Dava is like that of Oilas Chayva, to say that the reason why you require smicha is because it's totally burnt, because you don't have that by Sham and Dava. And it still says the halacha of smicha over there. Rather, you have to then come to what's the common denominator, what's called the tzad hashava. Obviously, you're going to make it dependent on the reason why you do smicha is for the commonality of the two of them, of Oilas Chayva and Sham and Dava. What's the common denominator? That they're a carbon yachid, and they require nisachim and smicha. So to any carbon that is a carbon yachid requires nesachim, it requires smicha. And Shami Chayva fits that characteristic. And that's how you're going to know that Shami Chayva requires smicha according to Beis Hill, from a tzad hashava of Sham Nadava and of Oilas Chayva. And therefore, again, he could be the Tana of the Brisa that does require a source for Oilas Chayva for Kamishpat. It because you cannot learn out from the Dava, because the Dava is Mitzuyin, and even Bishil would agree to that point. And how does he know Sham Chayva? He learns it out from the common denominator of Oilas Chayva and of Sham and the Dava. So therefore, again, that Beitzah could be like Bishil too. Now, continuing with the halacha of our Mishnah. So the Gemara asks, V'sabi Beishamai, is that really true that Beishamai hold that Sham Chayva loy bayis smicha? As we said, there's two machlekes we have in the Mishnah. One is regarding Shalmei Chagiga, the Shalmei Chayva, the obligatory shlam. And Beishamai was quoted as saying that yes, you'll bring the Shalmei Chayva because it's a Chayva to bring. You're just not going to do smicha. And then Allah of the Mishnah, the Gemara seems to ask a contradiction. But Tanya, you learn the Beitzah. The Beitzah says, Rabbi Yasi says, Loy nechleku b'sham b'sil ala smicha atzman. It's not that they disagree on the smicha itself regarding the Shalmei Chayva, shetzarach. You actually do need to do smicha. And alman nechleku, what are they disagreeing about? I'll take it for smicha, shchita. The whole machlekes is regarding, but do you have to do the shchita right after the smicha? Shebeshami, I remain the tzarech. Beshami say you don't have to. So rather, you know what the opinion of Beshami was? It's not that they say you're not going to do smicha. Do the smicha erev Yom Tov and shechted hours later on Yom Tov, because you don't say take it for smicha shchita. You don't say that the shchita has to be right after the smicha. Besilam tzarech. So it says no, it has to be right after, and therefore it has to be on Yom Tov. So how can you say the machlekes in our Mishnah is that you don't do smicha? Which is actually, there's two ways to understand this machlekes. One is like we just quoted from the Beitzah. Everyone agrees you need to do smicha machlekes if it has to be right after the smicha to be the shchita. It says the Gemara, yes, but who the amiki haitana? This that we said in explanation of our Mishnah, Mishami, that you don't do smicha at all, is going like a different time like in the Beitzah, which is the machlekes tanoim. Amar basically Rabbi Yehudi says, "Leinechel go b'sham b'silab take the smicha shchita." No one's disagreeing regarding the halacha of right after you do the smicha, after the shchita shetzarech. Meaning, something that requires smicha, you have to do it right after. Because it says in the pasuk, "V'samach v'shalchat," right after smicha, after the shchita. What's machlokes in our Mishnah is ala smicha atzma. It's regarding the actual smicha b'sham chayva if it requires smicha. Shebeshama and it says you don't have to do smicha. As we just discussed before, it's not such a pashut halacha that requires smicha. We still has to come on to a tzad hashava of a shalmei nedava and a oilas chayva. Bisham doesn't hold to that. We still says no, it does require smicha. And again, so therefore these are two different ways how we have explaining this machlekes in our Mishnah. Is it that Bisham holds you don't need smicha, or it doesn't have to be taken for smicha shchita? You need it, but it doesn't have to be right after that you're going to do the shchita. Now, continuing on this halacha, we had another halacha that we had a machlekes in the Mishnah regarding oilas re'iyah. Oilas re'iyah is 3 times the year by the shalosh regalim. You have to bring, it says, you have to be seen by the Rebbeinu Shalom. You have to have a carbon oil. Now, Beishamai says that you're not going to bring it on Yom Tov, and Beisil holds that you are going to bring it on Yom Tov. So, turn around, we learned in a Beitzah that Ma'aseh b'Hil HaZaken. There was a story with Hil the elder, Shehevi Oilasa Azara, that he brought his oila to the Azara, Lismach Aleh b'Yom Tov, to go ahead and do smicha on the Yom Tov. So it's actually talking about both of his points. The soul disagrees with Rishama on 2 points. One, that you bring the oilas riyah, and the second one, that you even do smicha. So he was coming to do like his shita, that bringing the oila and do smicha. Chavru of Tamid Shami Hazaken. So the students of Shami the elder, they ganged up on Hill, and they said to him, what's going on with this? Tell me, what is this animal that you're bringing? He said to them, the kevahi, it's a female. Now, the reason why I'm saying female is because an oila cannot be from a nekeva, it has to be a zachar. So he's trying to tell them, like, don't start up, it's not an oila, don't worry, it's a nekeva. Well, I'm coming to bring it as a carbon shlomim, which, according to even the camp of Shammai, you're allowed to bring your shalmei chayva. As Rashi points out, it was from the great humility of Hill that he was changing the truth because of peace. He didn't want to make a whole ruckus over here as he went to bring his carbon oila. And actually, kishkishlim biznava, they actually wagged its tail to fool them that they should think that it's a nekeva, and they left him. Now the problem was, that day, the school of Shammai's hands, so to speak, were overpowered that of Beis Hill, because everyone saw, even Hill is because we're right. And they wanted to go ahead and make the halacha like Beis Shammai. But there was actually one of the elders of the students of Shammai, the elder, his name was Bava ben Buta. Although he was from the students of Beis Shammai, he knew that the halacha was like Beis Hillel. So the Shalach he sent us a Getin of days. The Haven he brought Kol Tzayin Kaddish from Yerushalayim. Tzayin Kaddish are from the highest quality sheep. He brought all the best to Zachen. V'hamidim ba'azar, and he put into the azar in the courtyard. And he says, Kol misharoitz lismoich yava v'yismoich, which obviously is not like Beis Shammai, because according to Shammai you never do smicha. So he's saying that whoever wants to could do smicha, which actually Taisa points out, it's chulin, you can't be chulin to azar. It says lav dafka to azar. It means in the Harabais, in the Temple Mount area. It says, okay, whoever wants to, everyone could come and do it, because he wanted to prove that the halacha is not like Beis Shammai, it's like Beis Hillel, that you could do smicha. And Beis Hillel, and therefore that day actually they were over. The Beis Hillel overpowered. They established halacha like Hill. There was no one that protested at all, and everyone agreed that the halacha is like Beis Hillel. Now, Shulmaisa, again there was a story. After this story, there was another story. B'tamid echad mitamid Beis Hillel, from one of the students of the camp of Hill. Again, he's coming to bring his oila to the Zara to do smicha. So one of the students of Beis Shammai encountered him. Amalai said to him, Mazu smicha, what's this smicha, that you want to do smicha and you want to violate the words of Beis Shammai when we disagree with you? Amalai said, and Mazu shtika, what's this silence that you should have been silent and you're not silent? So Shashka ben Azifa, he silenced him with rebuke. So then that student left. So Mabai says, Hilga, what you learn from this story is, Haitzum Mirabban, the Talmudic scholar. If his friend tells him something and he has to zog him back, he should not respond to him something more than what he told him. Meaning, you can give him a zog back, but don't tell him back more than what he said. Because the Iyo Amalei, he said to him, Mazu smicha, bosu du smicha. But Kamahadli said, and Mazu shtika. So he said it in the same way. You can give him back what he gave you, just don't give him back more than what he gave you. That's the lesson, says Abaya, from this story. Now, regarding this machlekes in our Mishnah, so the Gemara elaborates on their source opinions for this halacha of the Oilas Riyah, which, as we said, we spoke about on Amid Aleph regarding the Shalmi Chayva, regarding Smicha. And now we're going to discuss regarding the other one of Oilas Riyah, which we just brought two stories with that, which we actually focused on more on the Smicha part, which was the same idea of the Shalmi Chayva. Hanul in Beitzah. Amalam Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. So Beis Hillel is trying to prove his point that you could bring the Oilas Riyah on Yom Tov. He says, I'll tell you what. If a place where on the Shabbos you're not allowed to go ahead and do anything for a regular person, don't cook, you don't do any malachas for a regular person. Mutar ligvaya, you're allowed to do malachas for the food of Hashem, tmidin, musafin, there's all food, it's a kitchen. The whole Beis Mikdash, it's a butcher, it's a shop. Right? So you're allowed to do that, all that food for the Rebbeinu Shalom. So makam shemutar lehedyid, so a place, a situation where you're allowed to do all the malachas for food for a regular person on Yom Tov. It says hu levad v'yaslechem, all things that you need for eating, you're allowed to do on Yom Tov. So ein din shemutar ligvaya. So isn't it a kavachayim that you would be allowed to go ahead and do whatever is the food for the mizbeach, even the oilas riyah, that you'd be allowed to do that on Yom Tov? So Beis Hillel has a good raya. Says we're disagreeing. Could you bring oilas riyah on Yom Tov? What's highest? Shabbos you could bring for the Rebbeinu Shalom. Can't do beheaded. Yom Tov you're allowed to do for a person. You tell me how can you not do oilas riyah for the Rebbeinu Shalom? Only Beis Shammai says no. I could disprove your logic from a neder or nadam. Shemuter, where that and Yom Tov, it's a place that's permitted lahed. Yeah, you're allowed to make food for a regular person. You're allowed to fry your whatever, your chicken, whatever. And you agree to as vas l'gvaya. You're not allowed to bring in the Dam Nadavis on Yom Tov. So you see, it's not such a raya. You see, you could do it for head, not for l'gvaya. To Beis Hillel says, wait a second. Mal and the Dam Nadavis, you can't bring me a raya from the Dam Nadavis. Shein kivul zman, because there's no set time. What's high? Pink today, you're going to bring this carbon and that. You could have brought it last week. You can bring it next week. So of course you can't do it on Yom Tov to do a chil of malacha. Time about Eilas Re'iyah, but what are you going to say? Well, Eilas Re'iyah should kavu lemizman, which that has a set time, and this is reason number one that we find that Beishamai is saying that Basil is saying, well, it has a set time, so therefore you can be able to do it on Yom Tov. Beishamai says no, Abzuin kavu lazman. It's not true because actually it doesn't have a set time that has to be brought dafka today on Yom Tov, because it's not we learn the Mishnah Masechtas Chagiga. If someone did not bring his Shalmei Chagiga or his Eilas Re'iyah on the first day of Yom Tov, you could bring your Chagiga, you could bring your Eilas Re'iyah the whole Yom Tov. You have 7 days, including the last days of Yom Tov, to bring it. So it's not Kavu Zman, let's bring it a Cholamayim. Let's bring it to Tzatan. So therefore, you see that Eilas Re'iyah is going to be the same thing as in Dram Nadav. It's just like you say you can't bring it, you shouldn't be able to bring it over here either. Basil said, no, it's not true. No, this is considered has a set time. You know why? Because now we learned in that same Mishnah Chagiga that says, but if let's say the Yom Tov already passed and you didn't bring your Chagiga or your Eilas Re'iyah in the Chai Bachar Yusai, you're not responsible anymore, and therefore, as Rashi explains, you have to be concerned the person might be negligent or some aynus might happen the other days of Chol HaMoed, you're not able to bring it. So it's considered a limited time, and therefore it has a Kaviyah Zman, and therefore that's the Machlokes B'Sham Yisrael regarding if you're going to bring it, the Eilas Re'iyah on Yom Tov, like I said in the Mishnah, according to Basil, because as Kaviyah Zman, according to B'Sham, he considers that as no Kaviyah Zman. But then the Brisa continues and shows a second reasoning of the Machlokes. Amar B'Sham says now his point. He says, wait a second, Basil. Regarding doing malacha on Yom Tov, it says, Hu levadi asa lachem, which means you could do it for you, but loy legvaya, and not for Hashem. So you cannot bring Eilas Re'iyah because there's no eating. Shalmei Chagiga, you're eating from the carbon, but Eilas Re'iyah, there's only for Hashem. Which Amalem Basil said no. In the pasuk it says v'chagoyzim oisechag l'Hashem, which sounds like called the Hashem. Whatever's for Hashem, you could do on Yom Tov. In Kenya, what are you going to say? Matamalem lachem. I thought lachem comes to exclude legavaya. No, lachem, when it says for you, is excluding other things. Lachem v'lei lekutim, for you and not for the kutim. Lachem v'lei leklavim, for you and not for the dogs. But for the Rebbeinu Shalom, yeah, of course, it says Lashem, including all Lashem, and that's again the second source of the Machlokes of Bisham Yisrael regarding if you bring the Eilas Re'iyah on Yom Tov. Now the Gemara points out that Abishol Eimer B'Lashon Acheres. Abishol, he brought the same Kabul Chaimer that we had originally brought from Basil, which Basil had said, what do you mean? If a place that you're allowed to make food for a hedyot, isn't it a Kabul Chaimer, you should be able to do it like Vaya, because even on Shabbos, you can only do like Vaya, you can't do for hedyot, Zich on Yom Tov, that you could bring a Eilas Re'iyah. Abishol says it in a slightly different version. He says the following words, more of like a mashal. He says, Akira generally had place for 2 pots, and you put on the top, and it's applicable to say open and close. You could sometimes close it up with something, so it would have room for 2 pots. So on that, Abishal is quoting from Basil that tells Beis Shammai, wait a second, if in a situation where your kira, your oven is closed up, which refers to Shabbos, that you're not allowed to cook, but the oven, the stove of your master is open, hey, you're allowed to bring tamidim, Masafin on Shabbos, you're allowed to do all these cooking, all this stuff that the Rebbeinu Shalom, you're allowed to do. So so when your stove is open, which is on Yom Tov, isn't it Kabbalah that your master's oven should be open? What's haste? How does it make sense that you're not bringing Eilas Re'iyah on Yom Tov? And so to Elijah would tell us that your table shouldn't be full, and that your master's table should be empty. How can you say such a thing that you're going to have this discrepancy and tell me that you can't make a Eilas Re'iyah on Yom Tov when you could bring your own food? So says the Gemara, okay, sounds very similar to the first version. So the Gemara says, what is Abishal disagreeing with the Tanna Kama to say a different version? Isn't this the same idea? So the Gemara says, no. The difference is, Mar Savar, Abishal didn't mention that Beis Shammai said back, Nadar Menadav Seichichu. In the first version, they had a discussion. Basil said his point. Beis Shammai says, besides, if you're telling me that when you can make your food, Hashem Teshur should be able to make your food, then why didn't you say Nadar Menadav? That was what we had quoted in the first version. And they got into the whole discussion, can you compare it to Nidar and Davos or not? Now, Bishal's version, this is where the story ends. It doesn't have Bisham's rebuttal in compared to Nidar and Davos. So, therefore, explains the Gemara, because Abishal held Nidar and Davos created Yamtiv. Bisil actually holds you could bring Nidar and Davos in Yamtiv, and therefore Bishami can't say, oh, what do you mean, even L'Shitascha, or Nidar and Davos, it's not true. Bisil holds that you could bring Nidar and Davos in Yamtiv, therefore Bishami didn't give a response. It was only going to be based on Bisil's own logic that Bishami was going to try to refute him and say, how can you say that? Nidar and Davos, you hold that it's not brought, your master's, his food is not being done. So therefore, in this version, he didn't say it because Abishal holds that Bisil holds you could bring it. Umar Saba, the Tanakama's version was different because he holds in Krev Yamtiv. Bisil agrees you cannot bring the Nidar and Davos on Yamtiv, which the Gemara explains and says, Amar Avuna says L'Divri Ha'Omer, according to the Tanakama, who says Nidar and Davos in Krev Yamtiv, that even Bisil agrees that you cannot bring it on Yamtiv. So Loi Tema, he says an explanation. Don't say Midiraisa Merzichazi. That really, as Bisil himself had wrote the words Lashem, which sounds like Kol Lashem, which Kol Lashem Bisil was using for Elis Re'iyah, but maybe you would think that Bisil really holds everything for Hashem. That Davos biblically you also could bring it. Even according to the Tanakama's version, really Midiraisa you could bring it. He's telling you don't say this. But you would have thought to say that Lashem, Lashem includes all Karbanas, and only B'Rabbanahu the Gazibu Gezeir. But Rabbanan, the reason why Bisil would agree and not bring Nidar and Davos is because of rabbinic concern. What would that be? Shemiyasha. Because what's going to happen is people procrastinate. People are going to push over until Yom Tiv, and the reason why is because it's great. If I'm and then Nadav have to bring, I have so much company and Yom Tiv, Me'es, Tazah, see this. He's going to have meat on the Yom Tiv. Now the problem is, maybe when the Yom Tiv is going to come around, some aynus is going to happen, and he's not going to be able to bring his Ned and Nadava. Maybe no animals around. There was all sold out. Everyone's brought the Shana Chagiga. The problem is, if you're going to delay it, it's going to be Bal Ta'acha. Because everyone waits till the Yom Tiv and lets the Yom Tiv, and then you have a Bal Ta'acha if you don't bring it. Because you're delaying, you have, as we said in the previous Daf, you have to bring it by a certain time. So therefore, maybe that's what you would have thought to say. On that says, Rafuna, no. Don't say that Bisil in the Tanakama's version that holds that you cannot bring the Dam Davos is only rabbinic law, but really biblically holds that you could. I'll prove to you that no. That even biblically, in the Tanakama's version, Bisil holds you cannot bring the Dam Davos. It's loy chazu, it's not fit, and it's usr. Because, as Rashi explains, when it says Lashem, which Bisil was including called the Lashem, but it has to be similar to the other words in that pasuk too. What were the words over there? So he's saying Lashem is called the Lashem, but it has to be similar to the word B'chagoysim, which means the oil has to be similar to the Chagiga, which the Chagiga has a set time to be brought on that regal, not in the Dam Davos, which don't have a set time. And therefore, that wasn't included. But he brings a raya. What's his raya? He says because the Shtei HaLechem says the Shtei HaLechem are the two breads on Shavuos that are brought together with the Shalmi, the Kivsei Atzeres, which are the Shlom that you have to bring the Tzibur on Shavuos. Those two breads, the Chayvus HaYeminu, they're obligations of the day of Shavuos, and you can't bring it earlier. There's no earlier. It has to be brought on Shavuos. Therefore, the Lekala makes a Shemiyasha. Over there, obviously, you cannot decree that it might be delayed. You mean you want me to do it earlier? You can't do it earlier. It has to be done only on Yom Tov. And yet, in spite of that, since you could go ahead and have baked those breads from before Yom Tov, the Gemara tells us in Mesechta Menachos that Tzadik Yom Beis, Eina Doichel Loyes Shabbos V'Loyes Yom Tov. You're not allowed to bake the Shtei HaLechem, not on Shabbos, not on Yom Tov. Why not? Because it's actually not similar to Chagiga. Because Chagiga, its time of Shechita is set to be on the Yom Tov. That's when you have to shecht it. You couldn't have done it earlier because you have to do it on the same day, and you can't do it later because obviously it has to be on Yom Tov. Whereas the Shtei HaLechem, you could have baked it from before Yom Tov. And therefore, we don't let you bake it on Yom Tov. But one thing is, when you're telling me that you cannot bake the Shtei HaLechem, that halacha is a biblical law that you're saying is not similar to the Shana Chagiga. That's the same thing I'm going to tell you for the Oilas Re'iyah, for the Nadarm and the Davis, it's similar to the Shtei HaLechem that you don't have a heter to do it now. That's a biblical law. You can't tell me Gzer Shema Yasha, and that's why in the Nadarm and Davis you can't, because look at the Shtei HaLechem. Shtei HaLechem doesn't have a Shema Yasha. No, what Shema Yasha? I mean, we're delaying it for when? This is the only day I can bring it. And still you tell me that you cannot. Why not? Because it's a deiraisa. The halacha is that only something that has to be done today could be done today. But if you could have baked it from yesterday, then you can't bake it today. And if that's going to be the same thing in the Daf, it's not like Lashem includes everything. If Lashem included everything, then it would also include the Shtei HaLechem too, which is Lashem. No, it's not, because you could have done it from before. It's not Kabur Zman. That's the same thing for the Dar and the Davis. But the Gemara has one final point. It says that Ibaylu, the following question. But Divya, I'm according to the one who says the Dar and the Davis ain't created Miyamtiv, which we just had a Machlekes Tanoim in Beis Hill, if you could bring the Dar and the Davis and Yamtiv or not. So according to the one, the Tanakhama's version, that says that you cannot bring the Dar and the Davis and Yamtiv. What's the halacha? Okay, someone was over, and he did shech it. What's the halacha? Could he now be zorik the dam, which is really the primary thing you need from the carbon, to be considered that you did the carbon? So Rava Amar, he says that zorik es adam, you could spray the blood, amanas lahata basa b'achila, on the condition that you're permitting the meat to be eaten. In other words, what he means to say is, if the meat is still around, that therefore when you're going to spray the blood, it's going to be eat tzarich yamtiv, because now you're going to be able to eat the meat today. Okay, then you could spray the blood. If not, if let's say the meat's not around anymore, then you cannot spray the blood, because there's no need for that, and therefore it's only if it's a tzarich yamtiv that we're going to let you go ahead and spray the blood if the meat's there. Now, Rabbi Hunam, he says, tzarich es adam, you could spray the blood, amanas lahakta imurin le'erev, on the condition of that you're going to burn the sacrificial parts that following evening. Meaning, as Rashi explains, even if there's no need for validating the carbon, which that the halacha is you can't spray the blood at nighttime. Whereas burning the sacrificial parts is kasher kalalayla. That's we say the oila ma'ariv is connected the haktaris emurim. It's all night long, and you could wait till it gets dark and then you'll burn it. So as long as you'll have a purpose of this spraying the blood, because you'll be able to have, even though you're not being, there's nothing for the carbon here anymore of the meat, but you'll have the imurim, which you could only do if you spray the blood. So then you're allowed to go ahead and spray the blood. So Shemar says, my benai, what's the difference between them? The difference between them is, which Mefarshim asked, what do you mean? You just said really a difference between them. But even as it may, they're asking, the difference is nitma basar or sha'ava. If let's say the meat became tameh, or became lost, okay, so it's pretty obvious. L'Rava le'zarik, according to Rabbi, you're not going to spray the blood. Because, as Rashi points out, what's the whole problem with spraying the blood anyway? What's the Goris Gedilla? What are you doing already? So Rashi says, even though it's not a malacha, but it's still an Issa D'Rabbanan. The Mefarshim explains like masakin, you're like fixing something when you spraying the blood, it permits the carbon, but you can't spray the blood if there's no meat, because it has to have a oichel nefesh utility. Whereas Rabbi Huna Zark says, you could spray it because, like he said, there is a purposefulness of spraying the blood, which is for that of burning the emurim that night, which you would only do if you sprayed the blood. Now, but Meisver, the Gemara asked on Rabbi Huna that he said you could even spray the blood just for the purpose of the emurim from the following price. Brisa says, Kiv Seatzeres. We mentioned before the Shtei HaLechem, the two breads that are burned in Shavuos. So there's these lambs that are burned in Shavuos with the Shtei HaLechem, like it says in the parsha of Shorei Chesed regarding Shavuos, in Vayikra Chav Gimel, Vasisim Seir Izim. You should bring these two he-goats, one for a chatas, and Shnei Chavasim, two lambs. Those are the two kabasim that are burned in Shavuos. Now, what happens if Sheshachtim Shaloi Lishman? What happens if you slaughtered Shaloi Lishman, meaning you have to shecht it to be the Shalmei Tzibur, and you shecht it, let's say, to be an Oila. Oh, Sheshachtim, let's say you slaughtered Bein Lefnei Zmanan, whether before its time, meaning before Shavuos, which, as Rashi points out, you had designated to be the Kiv Seatzeres. It was supposed to be, it was made to be the Shlamim of the Shavuos, and then 2 days before Shavuos you went and you shechted it. Or Bein La'achazman, or whether after Shavuos. Halach is like this. Hadam Yizarik, you could spray the blood, Vabasi Achel, and you could eat the meat. Why? Because Rashi tells us, the Gemara tells us in the opening of Mesechta Zvachim on that Beis, Amid Aleph, Kol Azvachim, that first mission says, all the Kabbalah Shenizbuchu Shaloi Lishman, which is the case in all these cases we just said, whether it's Mana, Shaloi Bizman, you're not doing it for the Shalmei Atzeres. Kshem, it's kosher to be sacrificed, and it could be eaten. It's just not Ol Bam Shavtav, it's not fulfilling your obligation, but it's going to be kosher. So you could spray the blood and you could eat the meat. Now, but let's say you run into a problem, let's say Maisa Shabbos, let's say it's Shabbos. So it's not so pasha, because you can't do malachas that are unnecessary. So then Lo Yizrik, you can't spray the blood, because first of all, you can't even cook and roast today, and you're not going to eat for the meat. And by the time it comes night, it's nicer. So therefore, says the Beitzah, you can't spray the blood. Now, the Zarak, if you did spray the blood, let's say you didn't consult anyone, and you sprayed the blood, it's continued of Chavav and Al, then Hurtza, okay, it's considered accepted carbon, because the Maisa you did the Avodah, even though Shaloi Lishma, but it's considered kosher. On the condition that you're going to burn the sacrificial parts in the evening, meaning, go ahead and burn the Imur in the evening, and you can't burn it today on Shabbos itself, because it's not a chayva carbon today. You did a Shaloi Lishma, it's not even fulfilling the chayva sayah. Now the inference is, im zarak, it sounds like if you did spray the blood, the evid in, after the fact, yes. Initially not. You know why? The Beitzah said why. Because you can't eat the meat today. Wait a second, can't eat the meat, but there's still day more. So Bishlam according to Rabbi makes sense, because he says the only way you're allowed to go ahead and spray the blood is if you have the ability to eat the meat. According to him, it's difficult because he says that we let you spray the blood even on Shabbos if you have day more. Says the Gemara Kasha, yeah, it is a difficulty on it. If you want to give another answer and say no, Shani was Shabbos. The Isuri de Rabbanan of Shabbos, the Rabbanan were more machmer, Mishpos Yom Tiv, more than this, the Rabbanan of Yom Tiv, and therefore you could hold that on Yom Tiv it would be permitted to spray the blood because of the Eimurin, and therefore it wouldn't be a difficulty on Rabbi Baravun. Thank you for any time.